past decade, India has become one of the leading hubs for entrepreneurs, and today there are over 100,000 startups and more than 100 unicorns. However, in recent times, cases of corporate misgovernance have cast a black mark on the startup ecosystem. Venture capital funds and PE investors are increasingly wary of investing in startups due to governance issues at prominent startups such as BharatPay, Go Mechanic, Zomato, Byju's, Trell, Xilingo, to name a few. In our inaugural podcast, we will discuss corporate governance issues at startups in India. Our speaker today is Mr. Mysore Prasanna, an independent director and former general counsel of the Aditya Birla Group. Mr. Prasanna holds a master's degree in law from the University of Mysore and is a gold medalist. After being an independent counsel for about 7 years, he worked as head of the legal function for over 28 years with different business groups in the country. Mr. Prasanna served as a chief legal officer of Larsen and Toubro Limited for 7 years. For about 12 years, Mr. Prasanna was associated with the Aditya Birla Group as a general counsel, spearheading mergers and acquisitions. Mr. Prasanna is a life member of the International Center for Alternative Dispute Resolution in Delhi. He was conferred with prestigious business and industry awards for his achievements in the field of corporate law. He is a regular speaker on diverse topics before various forums, both national and international. Mr. Prasanna conducts general and bespoke training programs on a variety of legal topics, both for legal and non legal executives. A warm welcome, Mr. Prasanna, to the inaugural podcast from Fraudopedia. Why is corporate governance important for startups?
Yeah, before I answer that question, let me just step back and say that this entire concept of corporate governance, which of course was triggered by various global failures and then made into general rules under the listing agreement and all of that stuff, they were typically applied to listed companies. And it is very heartening that over a period of time, that corporate governance has been institutionalized in almost all the companies, whether listed or not. And that goes even to the startups, because at the end of the day, transparency is the key element of corporate governance. How you run an organization and what kind of disclosures that you make and what kind of financial controls you have, and also the kind of accountability to the shareholders and other stakeholders in the organization. So at the end of the day, if you don't have a robust corporate governance structure, right from the time you do your first round of funding, startups can really face a lot of trouble. And also, the investors may not look at these startups as a safe investment. At the end of the day, transparency, accountability, and the commitment of the founders, all of that, and also the kind of governance structure through any which way it's called advisory board or the fiduciary board, whatever it is, that is not transparent and that is not clearly visible to the investors, unlikely that startups will get any fund at all. So, corporate governance is, in a way, the backbone of a startup.
Does good corporate governance attract capital at attractive rates, and vice versa? Is there a penalty for bad governance?
That's a very interesting question. What is the basis on which someone would make a decision to invest in a particular startup? Is it a leap of faith, or is it founded on good market indicators, or is it founded on the kind of future the particular business or the startup has, And more importantly, is it likely that this startup eventually becomes an attractive proposition for a much larger company to acquire, in which case there is a significant uptick of valuation? So there are a number of factors which people actually look at when you go for funding of a startup. The angel investors may simply, put some money and then hope that something will come out of it. But sophisticated investors who have invested in a number of startups all over the world actually look at different parameters for deciding whether to invest in this startup or not. So I believe that if you have a good corporate governance structure, and if you are able to demonstrate that the founders are not here to make a quick buck and exit, but they are going to stay on and make the company grow, the investors are most likely to look at that commitment as part of the founders' actual commitment to governance. And in my opinion, that is when the investor will feel comfortable to stay with the founders and invest money. Coming to whether there is a sort of a premium that corporate governance can attract. Yes, of course. I think all things considered, if I'm an investor, I may look at the top line, I may look, because there is no bottom line typically in startups. I may look at various other things and also look at competing startups and all of that stuff. But when I find that there is a very good governance structure, and in terms of reporting, in terms of accountability, in terms of financial controls, all of that stuff, I feel far more comfortable putting my money in a startup which has a good corporate governance structure. So there is no doubt about it. In fact, talking about penalty, yes, your investor can discount if there is not much of corporate governance structure there. Therefore, there is a premium and a discount for good or bad corporate governance structure. I think startup must take cognizance of the importance of this.
So, why are startups in India facing corporate governance challenges? Is this part of a larger problem of poor governance at companies in India?
I think, in my opinion, corporate governance has sort of found its roots. The only problem that I see is corporate governance from a reporting aspect has become something which is rule imposed rather than self imposed. I believe corporate governance is not really corporate governance unless there is a passion to institutionalize it voluntarily and go beyond the realms of governance. Because when you try to comply with the corporate governance structure as mandated by law or mandated by the regulator, you are actually doing compliance. In my opinion, corporate governance is not about compliance. Compliance is part of corporate governance. Therefore, one must understand it is something which varies from institution to institution, business to business. You have to define what is good corporate governance for you is. So, in my opinion, it depends upon the nature of business, it depends upon the geography in which you operate, it extends to the kind of reach you have to various markets, various investors, various shareholders, and the kind of expectation that they have that you are going to be a well behaved company. We talk about good corporate citizen and all of that stuff. That's fine. Those are all, metaphorical. You are good to the society, therefore you're a good corporate citizen. But in my opinion, startups, by the very notion of the term, need to make sure that every step they go on tweaking the corporate governance structure and not simply mimic something which is established for a listed company. That's not my idea of corporate governance for a startup. The corporate governance for a startup is basically a reflection of the expectations of disclosures and transparency that the investor actually expects from the startup and the founders. If you meet that as a threshold compliance of corporate governance, you would have done a very good beginning, and then you would have retained the investor confidence. You are most likely to succeed in the second round, third round, as the case may be.
So, governance then, is it solely the responsibility of the founders, the board, the auditors, or investor?
Well, it's a question of chicken and egg, right? If I am the founder of a startup, what do I think of corporate governance? How do I do it? Does it mean that I constitute a board, invite a few respectable names, and give it a semblance of respectability, and then say, "Oh yeah, I've got now a board," and a person looking at it from outside is very happy that responsible people are part of the board? In my opinion, that's very myopic view, because you may have good names on people representing on the board, but how much time are they able to devote to actually the running of the company or overseeing the operations of the company? How are they able to make sure that the founders who are going piggyback on their reputation to raise money are not going to let them down? Because if the startup fails to attract investors, it doesn't mean whom you have on the board. It is eventually the core competency of the founders, the core commitment of the founders to make things happen and to sell a very credible story about the startup, and then establish as to how they are going to run that particular business, and what kind of financial reporting that they would do. How are they going to make themselves accountable? Are they going to actually take a hit if something goes wrong, or are they here to make a fast buck whether the startup succeeds or not? So in my opinion, uh, it is very important for the founders to start from scratch, look at the business, and look at the peers, how they have actually structured corporate governance mechanism, and perhaps talk to the investors themselves. So, what kind of corporate governance structure would they like to have in this startup, given the nature of the business? I think it's a question of a consultative process than being very subjective about having a corporate governance structure. In my opinion, it should be very objective, it should be consultative. At the end of the day, it should be something which everybody can sign off, and nobody can point a finger tomorrow at the founders. So founders are advised to rely more on not just their advisors, but actually the investors, and also the kind of peers who have a good corporate governance structure. Maybe they can nothing wrong in mimicking it.
So, what can startups then learn from their counterparts globally and from perhaps other established companies in India?
Of course, learning is a never-ending process, and it is. If I imagine a startup, just new kid on the block, what would that startup actually do? In my opinion, it is unlikely to be bogged down by corporate governance on day one or day two, because the startup itself has to establish itself. The focus is more on the kind of new business that they are, new idea that they are bringing to the table. So the founders in the very infancy of the startup are more concerned to ideation and to take forward their particular idea of business, and then make it appealing to either the users or to upstream service providers who can later on take up take over the startup and give them certain valuations. The whole focus of founders at the point of beginning is about how can they maximize value for themselves, and also how can they actually create a value proposition for the investors. It is only when they have made certain progress that they assume that they should now be responsible in the way they run the organization because they have their skin in the game. Nobody disputes that. But when others have a skin in the game, then the founders are going to be extremely concerned of not only maintaining their own reputation, but also in making sure that they deliver value to the investors. Now, that value can only be derived from the way you run the business. When you say from the way you run the business, it means the governance structure. How are you going to actually make sure that your financial reporting is robust? Investors given adequate information because they are shareholders, and you may even have negotiated with them a certain IRR and then certain exit mechanism and all of that stuff. And if you do not have all of that, if you don't regain the confidence of the investors or keep the confidence of the investors, it most likely that the investors will simply write off whatever they've invested, and then that's a bad story. The startup will really suffer a long way. If so, to summarize, in my opinion, the institutionalization of corporate governance in whatever scale that is required with a startup happens the moment others have a skin in the game. And that's the point at which the founder should really, really sit up and take notice that they are responsible to others.
So, crystal gazing into the future, what do you see as the top three challenges for startups in India insofar as governance is concerned?
I think this question actually takes us back to the basics of corporate governance. In my opinion, the fundamental thing that the founder should really look at, are they selling a dream or are they selling a value proposition? It's very important for founders not to go overboard and overrepresent and underdeliver. It's a very, very important thing. In fact, you could be conservative in the way you present an idea, and if idea actually turns out to be much more than what you presented, investors are extremely happy because you are being cautious, not trying to sort of magnify the whole thing to unbelievable dimensions, as many, many startups have done. They have spun a dream and they have spun their own fantasy, and then they have tried to snare investors only to feel later on that they actually misled the investors. So, in my opinion, at the very first germination of corporate governance is when the founders actually sell the proposition to an investor. That comes with a lot of responsibility. So, corporate governance, in its very abstract notion, is at the back of presentation of a business idea, presentation of an investment proposition. Having done that, in my opinion, the moment the investor puts in money, you need to understand that your transparency of management, the kind of spend that you do on vary, because we talk about cash burn. When you talk about that word cash burn, it simply means you should actually tell the investor where the money is going, which means the financial reporting has to be very robust and it should be as frequent as possible, not just quarter on anything, because cash burn in a startup can happen on a weekly basis. So we need to make sure there's a robust mechanism of reporting all of that. And I also feel that it's good to have an advisory board, people who are in the particular space, who have experience. You should actually use them as a sounding board. An advisory board, as opposed to the fiduciary board, is a very good sounding board. You can validate certain propositions, certain ideas before actually taking it up to the fiduciary board and getting certain corporate approvals to make certain investments and various other initiatives that you want to take. So, in my opinion, transparency, fiduciary obligation, financial reporting, and the way you treat employees and the way you retain employees, and also the founders themselves, how committed they are to stay on and not simply jump ship and follow some other idea, chunking the idea with which they started. So these kind of things should completely be avoided in order to gain reputation as people who can be relied on.
We conclude this podcast and thank Mr. Prasanna for sharing his insights and time with us. We hope that you find this podcast interesting and meaningful. See you next month.